I will now resume with the decisions arising from the meeting of the Federal Cabinet today, January 7th. As I would have indicated at the front end of this Cabinet report, there were some 7 areas where the task force would have deliberated as they had seen in their judgment could become adversely affected by the rapid spread of the Omicron variant. So I now proceed to the remaining 4 areas. Among the other areas that would have been looked at would have been the issue of the convening of mass events. And we looked at this within the context of the fact that the COVID-19 task force would have been made aware by the leadership of the Royal St. Christopher and Nevis Police Force that for the month of December alone, some 521 applications for events would have been made to the office of the Commissioner of Police, of which some 353 would have been approved. By extension, for the month of January, a number of requests would have been put forward to the office of the Commissioner, and for some of these events, the numbers of patrons that would have been listed would have been in excess of 300. We are also recognizing that based on the spread that we have seen in the last several weeks in terms of the Omicron variant, that a number of our events that would have been held, direct events as well as fringe events associated with Carnival and post-Carnival, would have returned outbreaks or cluster outbreaks with those events. These include the Bubble Juve. They also include the Miss St. Kitts pageant. And they also include some private events, including some brunches. As the case is at the moment with these outbreaks in these various clustered events, the Cabinet has taken under advisement the guidance of the COVID-19 task force, and as a result of this, all mass events, applications, and approvals are now being reviewed by the Office of the Commissioner of Police, and in the event a decision has to be made that these or some of these events would have to be cancelled, the police force will duly notify the applicants and conveners or event organizers for these functions, since we prefer to err on the side of caution and not enable a situation like what we already see developing with some of the mass events. We would have also looked at the cruise sector and the hotel sector. And we would have recognized, as most of us would have gathered by looking at the news, especially international news, that the cruise sector is already beginning to be impacted by COVID-19 once more, after, in our case, just shortly resuming last June 2021. We would have noted, for example, that at present, at least 90 vessels globally are plying the waters with varying rates of infected passengers and crew members on board. At the same time, we have to follow our own guidelines that we would have put in place as a member state of CARICOM and under the guidance of CARFA, as well as our own local Ministry of Health officials led by the CMO, in terms of keeping our people safe, keeping our borders safe, etc. And as a result of this, and recognizing that there would have been a pre-existing arrangement in terms of guidelines for the cruise sector, the Cabinet has made a decision that both the Ministry of Health as well as the Ministry of Tourism and the St. Kitts Tourism Authority would be reviewing the established protocols as a matter of urgency with a view to ensuring that they meet the mustard test in terms of what is currently unfolding globally, especially under the impact of the Omicron variant. By extension, in terms of the hotel sector, a review would also be done in terms of the level to which that sector has been impacted by COVID-19. We would have also recognized that upon departure, a number of hotel guests would have tested positive, and of course, they would not have been predicting that this would have been a likely outcome of part of a vacation that they would have been planning for. So this is another area that we are also examining. By extension, the Cabinet is also has also decided to review the existing policy where we have now moved from a 24-hour quarantine to a non-quarantine environment, whereby we would have made a decision several weeks back that persons who had a negative test within 3 hours of arriving in the Federation and being fully vaccinated would not have required quarantine. This too is being reviewed by a special committee guided by the data, of course, to determine if there are changes that would be warranted to this change in quarantine policy that we would have put in place. And the final area that the Cabinet would have deliberated on today has to do with the issue of the supply chain issues that we are seeing globally within the context of our own economic recovery and rebalancing strategy coming out of COVID, led by the Ministry of Finance under consultancy guidance from Deloitte. This committee is being chaired by the Financial Secretary with support from the Ministry of International Trade, also from customs, etc., and we would have representation from the private sector. That committee begins its work in earnest as of next week. However, insofar as the issues of supply chain would be concerned, given that we are a net importer of food, the Ministry of Agriculture will also be part of this process. And among the various measures that we will be looking at would be the whole issue of support to our citizens and residents in terms of having assistance from agriculture with the production of small crops, if you have sufficient backyard space, to help us to improve our food security, also to ensure that nutrition is still a high priority for us, because as we very well know from the Ministry of Health, that in order for us to fight disease and infection, it demands consumption of a healthy diet. And since we have to rely on imports of food in order to meet our local demands, it stands to reason that the time has come for us more now than ever to look at how best we can sustain ourselves. At the same time, that committee will also be looking at various measures, including but not limited to the containment of port charges in spite of the dramatic spikes that we are seeing in the cost of freight, which has had a knock-on effect on the cost of goods here locally. So we will have more to share with the public on this particular committee. In the meantime, the work must begin now in terms of the mitigation measures that the Cabinet has put in place so that we can look at the best scenario to survive this latest fourth wave, which has presented itself to us in rude fashion by Omicron. However, before I close, I also need to mention two things. One, as a reminder to what Superintendent Henry would have indicated, in that we are no longer under a state of emergency as a result of the end of year, December 31st. From January 1st, we are now under special regulations coming out of the COVID-19 Prevention and Control Act. And to reiterate what he stated, most, if not all, of the provisions for protection and guidance relative to COVID-19 would be covered under the new set of regs that would have been issued for January 1st onwards. We are also intending to reach out to the private sector in terms of their own COVID-19 vigilance, their own mitigation measures in the workforce in case there needs to be contraction, that they too begin to have their own measures in place to respond to it. Mr. Superintendent Henry would have also alluded to regulations when it comes to churches. And yes, the Cabinet reiterates its commendations to churches in St. Kitts and Nevis, who for the most part have been very compliant when it comes to the COVID-19 prevention and control protocols. We wish to remind the churches that we are not out of the woods, and we expect them not to let their guard down, but to reinforce these measures for the protection of all, given how highly transmissible the variant that we are confronting is at the moment. I would also like to focus on the fact that in terms of the private sector, that we remind them that in as much as there are compliance officers provided to the COVID-19 task force and under the supervision of the National Emergency Management Agency, there are only 59 of these officers. So we really have to have a partnership approach in terms of policing the regulations and the various protocols, entry protocols into places of business, mask wearing, hand sanitizing, etc. But at the same time, we expect them to be proactive in the workspace itself, even if it has to call for a monitor or so forth, to be able to ensure that these protocols are being maintained to the highest level. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister Phipps. And